On career day in middle school, I gave a presentation on being an animator. I'd always been an artsy kid, but two things solidified my ambition for this profession. This snippet on the making of Brave, and Thomas the Tank Engine's transition to 3D animation. I eventually went to art school and, got my degree, woohoo! But I can still trace the source of my inspiration to this shift. Thomas and Friends is probably best remembered as a model production. Model trains roamed custom-built worlds that really existed in physical space, and has been hailed as the greatest model railway ever. There's just something about watching these engines steaming along. It's the same feeling you get when viewing a real one, or even a toy. There's a charm to it, even with the occasional goofs. Many children's shows, especially in the UK, were produced by means of stop-motion or claymation. Pingu, Bob, and so on. Thomas is slightly different from these, as these engines weren't animated frame by frame, but rather moved on their own via electric currents and had remote control mechanisms that allowed the eyes to move in real time. What you see is what you get. The humans and animals were static for the most part, with some limited moments of stop motion. They dubbed this method. The first series released in 1984 and was produced largely in the same way until 2007. In 2008, the decision was made to integrate CGI elements into the show via the faces, humans, and creatures. This was provided by Nitrogen Studios. I remember when I saw this for the first time as a kid and being completely blindsided. Do my eyes deceive me? Are the faces moving?
Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm! What's the procedure, everyone?
As an avid fan, this was a huge deviation from the status quo, and I was here for it. Some people find the fact that the faces didn't move before unsettling, and, fair enough, but for regular viewers of the show, it was simply just the way it was. The show had never had something as simple as lip sync in its entire history. Hit Entertainment, who owned Thomas at the time, originally wanted to do a few more series in this style, but they were running out of money and had to make some hard decisions. At this point, Thomas was really unlike most other programs on TV. It wasn't flashy like a lot of other animated shows, and it did stand out. For better or for worse. Something had to change, or it was the end of the line. Hit decided that the next step would be to go completely CGI and leave the models behind. Stardust Pictures, who had previously worked on a selection of DreamWorks animation projects and also assisted with Series 12, produced a fully 3D test, reanimating an episode from a recent series, Thomas and the Stinky Cheese. Though, according to an interview with Greg Tiernan, director and co-founder of Nitrogen Studios, it was his team that did it. There isn't a whole lot of info about this out there, but in the end, the test audiences responded well. Greg Tiernan... Oh.
Rooting for you! We were all rooting for you! How dare you!
With the success of the test, Nitrogen was tasked with rebuilding Sodor from the ground up.
It was a task of gargantuan proportions, and one which is ongoing. In order to recreate Sodor in CGI, every facet of the original show had to be recreated, including every building, vehicle, prop, and character. That's hundreds of thousands of individual assets. Our initial task was to create enough assets to get stories underway and give a believable setting to these stories. Hang on, Caleb, I'm not Canadian, I'm Welsh.
Sure you are. Thomas made his CGI debut in the 2009 hour-long special, Hero of the Rails. Right from the get-go, you can tell that the Nitrogen team was taking a lot of notes from the previous series. They wasted no time taking advantage of the new medium in the best way.
Oh, what are the rules? What are the rules? What are the rules? What are the rules?
The rules of the universe were the same, but now you could see more details and nuance that could only be shown with movement. And I think movement is the key word here. The engines still moved down the track as they did before, but now they swayed a little bit, or leaned when they stopped suddenly. You got little things like flocks of birds flying in the background, or people just going about their business. Thomas was livelier than it's ever been. What's great about it for the engines is that they can react to things in real time. There's no need to change the shot just to change the face. Complex actions happen, and you can see right away how they feel about it. Humans are able to express themselves with body language like never before. It's simple stuff for a standard CG show, but revolutionary for this one. I think they did a great job. I was obsessed with Hero of the Rails when it first came out. I watched it every night when I got home from school for at least a week. Later, when they released their progression reels, I was hooked. For that career day I mentioned earlier, little 10-year-old me actually called Nitrogen Studios, and, well, the secretary was very nice. Let's take a look at why I think this transition worked. If there was ever a time to reboot a show, a medium switch was definitely it. But instead of a complete redo, Thomas just continued. They took what was already there before and didn't try to bend it into something else. The characters all pretty much look how they did as miniatures, though they were built from scratch. There are some minor differences here and there, but nothing stands out as glaringly wrong. Well, okay, fair enough. It probably helped that the OG models were sent to the studio as reference for the modelers. The faces are a notable change. In the series prior, the faces appeared to try and emulate the modeled expressions of the static faces. They were redesigned again though for the full CG switch, and seemed to lean more into their own style. I think a large reason for moving away from the original face designs was simply because each expression was so distinct, it would be difficult to rig the faces to be able to transition between them smoothly. CG technology has come a long way since then, and I'd be very curious to see a more experimental take on the animation. The redesigns are still pretty appealing though, and retain a lot of the character and charm of the originals. Mostly. I think we all know the writing during this period was flawed.
Slow down, Thomas! You're spilling my bubble liquid!
Really?
But visually, the core principles are on display. It's a show about machines, and they really feel like them. I dare say even more so than the models. The direction and sound design play huge parts.
Thomas was lowered and landed with a jolt and a judder.
We're able to get shots from underneath the engine where you can see all the internal mechanisms at work. Low angles make them look larger than life. The sounds lean fully into these metal beasts weighing tons.
And both engines were coupled up to their heavy loads. Edward puffed forward.
It's an expensive looking show, for the most part, and definitely looked the part to compete with other shows of the decade. It really is a shame though that the scripts in this era were so nonsensical, but you can tell the writers were having fun doing things they couldn't do before. There's some good direction in this era, but there are also a lot of reused camera angles and shots that you just see over and over and over again. Perhaps this was an attempt to stay faithful to the model series before it, but there really just wasn't a need to do that, and I think it just makes it considerably less interesting to watch. I reckon it probably saved a lot of production time though. Still, there are enough awesome shots to make up for the lackluster ones. In 2012, Nitrogen Studios wrapped its last Thomas & Friends project as their contract was not renewed. Mattel had recently bought out Hit Entertainment, and instead the assets were handed over to Arc Productions. Seeing their first run out of the gate really makes you appreciate the level of polish put into Nitrogen's work. There are some things that Arc improved on, sure, but other things just don't feel natural or finished. In fairness, their first project, King of the Railway, directed by Rob Silvestri, was on extreme deadlines, and a redesign of Steven's model like halfway through production caused a lot of scenes to have to be redone. While they were able to use a lot of Nitrogen's assets, it's been said that there were a number of things that didn't quite make it in the transfer as they became corrupted or unusable. As someone who is familiar with 3D software, specifically Maya, I can attest to the fact that sometimes things break, and if you don't have a backup, you're out of luck. This is a reminder to save your files and save multiple versions of them. Again though, this wasn't a reboot, just a continuation. It was also at this time a new head writer appeared to restore the kind of storytelling Thomas was known for. What I really appreciate about this era though, is that with each series Arc produced, they made noticeable improvements every year. The rocky start can be forgiven because they were still getting their bearings. Nitrogen made small improvements as time went on, such as including brake fans at the end of the trains, but their library of work looks largely the same. It's cohesive, but things like the background grass never get better. Arc's series all look distinctly different from each other, especially 19. This is when I would say they really hit their stride. The lighting and shading reaches a new level, and the animation is really expressive. From the start, Arc always pushed the expressions and facial animations more than Nitrogen did. Nitrogen's way of animating them was confined and very symmetrical. Generally in animation, you want to avoid symmetry to make your character expressions more dynamic. Arc also pushed the direction. The camera is doing way more interesting things and is really making the most of being a CGI show. At first though, I would say the fancy angles are let down by the sets, which Nitrogen designed to be only seen from certain angles. But with time, the sets got updates and then the direction really got to shine. While Nitrogen had one director for Thomas, Arc had a number of them. Rob Silvestri, David David Stoughton, and Don Spencer. Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, directed by David Stoughton, is what I would call peak CGI Thomas. The bumps are smoothed out, and now the team was just having fun making art. There's so much to love here, especially from a visual standpoint, and really it just deserves its own video. In 2016, Arc Productions declared bankruptcy and was acquired by Jamfeld Toronto, who rehired most of Arc's previous staff. For 8 years, Thomas had been fully CG, and though it had been 2 different production companies, it was still the same show. Thomas as a brand wasn't doing super hot though, and we could point fingers all day about why, but once again, it was time to make a big change for the franchise. The decision was made to rebrand the show as Thomas and Friends Big World, Big Adventures, as a soft reboot with a focus on international locations. There was also a conscious effort to just speed things up and make Thomas flashier than ever. One of the biggest changes you clock right away is that the engines can gesture and wiggle around. It's kind of like Cars, but Lightning McQueen doesn't have a driver getting shaken around inside of him whenever he feels the urge to dance. If I was a passenger and I just needed to get to work and the train at the platform started shaking, I'd be terrified. The engine models were not built to do this. For good reason, because trains don't do that. The movements in the Nitrogen era were already exaggerated, but that was at least momentum-based movement, which was attempting to follow the rules of physics. These are machines that weigh hundreds of tons. Seeing them just bobbing around is weird. Weight is something very important in animation. Without it, things feel floaty and unnatural. There's a distinct lack of weight in the Big World era. With settings still attempting to be semi-realistic, there's a tangible juxtaposition with characters unbound by gravity. It's a really bizarre middle ground. Half of it wants to be a silly cartoon, while the other half just wants to be what it was. It really seemed like the overhead powers that be wanted Thomas to be anything but a locomotive. This video is just meant to look at the visual elements, but it's hard to separate them from the writing that orders it. I think Thomas was always at an advantage in this medium because in terms of animation, the main cast as vehicles primarily only require facial animations, and some slight attention to translations as they move. Humans and animals have more moving parts and are much more complicated and time-intensive to animate. It never made sense to me that when the budget was already tight, it was decided to add more animation to the characters that previously did not require it, and add more locations that they couldn't afford to make. Most international sets use retextured assets from Sodor. I think given enough resources, they could have looked nice, but the team had no time and no money. In addition to the absence of weight, there's also just an absence of ballast. Everything feels basic and unrefined. Again, this is just due to no budget and no time. These are very capable artists. Even stranger, the main cast was updated with rivets and handrails in an attempt to make them more realistic looking. There are 2 clear and conflicting directions here, a show at war with itself, and in the end, neither side won. Big World ran for 3 series and then was unceremoniously cancelled. And then that's it, no more show. Okay, the show actually did fully reboot as a 2D cartoon. Problems with weight, physics, and realism are no longer an issue. Frankly, I don't have a lot to say about it because I just haven't seen it. It does strike me as odd to make a vehicle show in 2D. Non-organic machines rotating in space is more practical in 3D. But given the cartoony direction, it checks out. From what I've seen, it seems well done for what it is, but ultimately it just isn't Thomas. It's difficult to take an existing thing and change it without alienating some of the viewer base. Some things are easy to translate into another medium, and others aren't. I think Thomas's transition to 3D helped keep the show going for much longer than it would have otherwise, and there are teams of dedicated people who made that happen. You can tell a lot of love and care was put into these productions. It's a shame that it couldn't continue, but not much lasts forever, and the stories that were made still exist. And who knows, maybe that theatrical Thomas film will actually come out.
How do you say it?
Gargantuan.
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 Gargantuan. You may have to edit this